Agatha Raisin and the Deadly Christmas Farewell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Detective Notebook. Carsely is glowing with Christmas lights, warm smiles, and whispered goodbyes. A farewell meant to bring peace instead leaves Agatha Raisin uneasy. Beneath the tinsel and kindness, something feels dangerously final. Who can she trust when everyone has a secret? Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Chapter 1. A Village Wrapped Too Tightly. Agatha Raisin frowned at her reflection in the hallway mirror, tugging at the collar of her holiday sweater as if it might somehow shield her from the festive chaos outside. The scent of pine and cinnamon drifted through her cottage, mingling with the faint tang of coal smoke from the grate. She had never much cared for Christmas, and this year felt particularly insistent, as though the entire village of Carsely had conspired to smother her in tinsel and good cheer. She muttered under her breath about the relentless goodwill of neighbors who seemed determined to smile through every underlying tension. Down the lane, wreaths swung gently on doors, their red ribbons vibrant against frost-dusted stone. Shop windows twinkled with fairy lights, showcasing displays of hand-knitted scarves, polished ornaments, and trays of gingerbread shaped like reindeer. Villagers bustled past, some laughing, some hurrying with their arms full of packages. Yet Agatha noticed the subtle signs of friction, a lifted eyebrow here, a tight-lipped smile there. Even in the most innocent of greetings, there was a shadow of competition, a hint of irritation barely concealed beneath seasonal cheer. Agatha poured herself a cup of coffee, strong enough to sharpen the senses and perhaps steel her patience for the day ahead. She placed it on the kitchen table next to a plate of shortbread she hadn't yet touched, noticing the faint dusting of sugar that sparkled like frost. She could hear the faint sound of carolers down the street, their voices sweet but slightly off-key. Even music, it seemed, could not disguise the undercurrents of tension that wove through Carsely. Agatha sipped, letting the warmth settle in her chest, and reflected that the village was more than its picturesque exterior. There were stories simmering beneath every wreath and holly sprig. The mail arrived with a flurry of envelopes and cards, each neatly addressed, each a potential spark in the delicate web of village relations. Agatha scanned the names, noting the subtle differences in handwriting and ink, the way some people had gone out of their way to embellish their greetings. Some cards were overly polite, others faintly sharp in their phrasing. It was the kind of detail most people overlooked, but Agatha, who had always read people like open books, noticed everything. She sensed the undercurrents of envy, of long-held grudges, and of relief that Celia's departure might finally shift the balance of power in Carsely's tightly knit society. Stepping outside, Agatha felt the cold bite of winter on her cheeks as she walked along the lane toward the village square. Children played near the fountain, their laughter ringing through the crisp air, but even that happiness seemed measured, bounded by invisible rules. Neighbors exchanged pleasantries with exaggerated warmth, their glances lingering in ways that spoke louder than words. Everywhere she looked, the festival of goodwill hid subtle rivalries, whispered resentments, and alliances forged more out of necessity than affection. Agatha smirked at the thought. Mince pies and carols might sweeten the air, but they could not disguise the truth of human nature. By the time she reached the square, the first hints of afternoon light shimmered off frost-covered rooftops. The village was alive with preparation, yet beneath the cheerful facade, Agatha could feel the tension coiling, waiting for the farewell party to ignite it fully. She adjusted her scarf, taking in the sights and sounds, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She was ready, not for the tinsel, not for the laughter, but for the secrets waiting to unravel. The front door of Celia Mountford's home opened with a crisp click, revealing a hallway polished to perfection. The scent of pine mingled with waxed floors, a carefully curated aroma that spoke more of control than warmth. Guests stepped inside, removing gloves and scarves with precision, their chatter polite yet brittle, like fine china vibrating with hidden tension. Agatha Raisin paused at the threshold, scanning the room with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading every twitch, every glance, every measured smile.
This was not a place for careless emotions. It was a stage, and each villager performed a role they had long perfected. Celia herself stood near the hearth, a vision of poise and composure, her dress crisp and her smile sharp. She greeted each guest with a hand extended in elegance, yet her eyes flickered briefly, betraying a flicker of unease. Agatha noticed it immediately, a subtle tightening at the corner of her mouth, the almost imperceptible shift in posture as she responded to whispered pleasantries. Some villagers returned the greeting with warmth, others with a rehearsed brightness that hid what they truly felt. Relief, resentment, fear, all mingled beneath the surface of holiday cheer, and Agatha catalogued each nuance silently, like a detective collecting invisible evidence. The small sitting room was filled with festive decor, holly wreaths, candles flickering in crystal holders, and a meticulously arranged tree glittering with ornaments. Yet the warmth of the decorations could not soften the chill that hung between certain guests. Polite speeches began, compliments flowing in measured tones. "Celia will miss your enthusiasm," someone said, their words edged with more than gratitude. Another added, "Your guidance has always been memorable," each syllable carefully balanced between praise and subtle criticism. Agatha listened, sensing the undercurrents of buried disputes and unresolved rivalries beneath the surface of every courteous remark. Then came the gift exchange. Celia's perfectly folded presents, each wrapped with precise bows, were passed around, and one in particular drew Agatha's attention. She watched as a woman offered a delicately wrapped package, the wrapping slightly too elaborate, the ribbon unnaturally tight. Celia unwrapped it, and her polite smile faltered for just a heartbeat before she replaced it with practiced grace. Something about the gift's contents, a small trinket with an oddly pointed sentiment, felt deliberately chosen. Murmurs rippled through the room, and Agatha's instincts sharpened. This was not innocent generosity. Whoever had given it had a message, and it was meant to land exactly where it had. Conversation continued, punctuated by laughter that rang a little too high, a little too forced. Agatha noted the subtle power plays, a slight tilt of the head here, a carefully timed compliment there. Celia responded to each interaction with a masterful blend of charm and command, but in moments when no one was looking directly at her, she seemed slightly off balance, as though the polished exterior could not entirely conceal the weight she carried. Agatha felt a prickle of anticipation, aware that this farewell, so outwardly festive, might leave more than memories behind. As the evening drew to a close, guests began to take their leave, exchanging hurried farewells with smiles that vanished the instant backs were turned. Celia's composure returned with the door closing behind each visitor, but Agatha lingered, observing the residual tension in the room. Every glance, every whispered comment had revealed more than anyone would admit aloud. She knew, with the quiet certainty of experience, that beneath the tinsel and carols the night had shifted imperceptibly. Secrets had been tested, loyalties hinted at, and the first threads of something far darker had begun to unravel.
Chapter 2. Snow Falls, Secrets Surface. Morning light spilled softly over Carsely, illuminating rooftops blanketed in pristine snow. The village looked peaceful, almost impossibly so, as if the world had pressed pause to admire the holiday scenery. Chimneys exhaled thin wisps of smoke, and the crunch of boots against frost-laced paths punctuated the quiet. Agatha Raisin wrapped her scarf tightly, drawing in the cold air with a shiver. Yet beneath the idyllic scene, her instincts prickled. Something was off. The farewell party lingered in her mind, like a melody missing a final note. The warmth of celebration had vanished overnight, leaving tension layered like frost over the village. As she wandered past the square, Agatha noted the familiar rhythms of daily life. Shopkeepers swept doorways with precise strokes, their voices carrying greetings that felt sharper than necessary. Children dragged sleds behind them, calling to friends with laughter that seemed just slightly brittle. And yet, in all this ordinary motion, a subtle dissonance persisted. A neighbor glanced at her, then quickly diverted their eyes, fingers brushing against a handkerchief as if hiding something. Agatha's sharp gaze caught it, noting the quick inhale and the slight tremor in their smile. Villagers whispered over fences, glances exchanged too deliberately to be casual. Rumors, she knew, had begun to ripple quietly, like fish darting beneath still water. Celia Mountford's absence was impossible to ignore. Agatha had expected to see her moving briskly through her usual routines, tending to her garden, greeting passers-by, managing minor disputes with her habitual poise. Yet today the windows were unlit, curtains drawn tightly against the weak winter sun. A car sat parked stubbornly in the driveway, tires crusted with overnight snow. Agatha approached the door, glancing at the polished brass handle and noting a faint smudge that seemed oddly recent. No sound came from inside. The house radiated silence, but not the comforting kind. This was the tense stillness of something unresolved. She began her inquiries with casual charm, dropping by the baker's for a cup of coffee and a slice of shortbread. "Seen Celia this morning?" she asked lightly, but the response was clipped, almost defensive. "No, haven't seen her. Didn't she go out early yesterday?" The baker's eyes flicked toward the street, then away, and Agatha caught the slight hesitation in tone. At the grocer's a similar pattern emerged, answers overly polite, smiles just a shade too bright, eyebrows raised as though surprised at the question. Each inconsistency, each evasive gesture, added to her unease. Small telling details accumulated like snowdrifts. A curtain half-drawn in a neighboring window, a mailbox unopened for days, a lantern still burning despite the morning sun. Agatha catalogued these signs meticulously. The village had its routines, and disruption of even minor habits could be revealing. A sense of foreboding crept along the edges of the picturesque streets, hinting that Celia's absence was more than simple delay or whim. The village was holding its breath, and Agatha could feel the tension threaded through every gesture, every polite word, every glance that lingered a fraction too long. By mid-morning, Agatha returned to her own cottage, the coffee in hand growing lukewarm. She studied the snow outside, tracing footprints that led to the village square, but not back. Every step seemed calculated, every path revealing its own secrets. Her mind replayed the farewell party, the stiff smiles, the pointed gifts, the subtle power plays. And now, in the hush of the snowy morning, those unresolved tensions seemed amplified. Somewhere beneath the frozen beauty of Carsely, a story was waiting to be uncovered, and Agatha sensed she would have to dig carefully to uncover the truth. Agatha stood before the door of Celia Mountford's cottage, her gloved hand hovering over the brass handle. A strange unease pressed against her chest, the kind that only grows when routine is shattered. She had expected a quiet morning, perhaps a delayed greeting or a note slipped under the door, but there was an unfamiliar stillness that gnawed at her instincts. The key rattled in her hand as she tried to turn it, only to find it locked. Repeated attempts yielded nothing. Something in the stubborn resistance of the door felt deliberate, a silent warning she could not ignore. The snow outside seemed heavier now, muffling sound and amplifying isolation. Agatha glanced around the street. Neighbors lingered, their curiosity polite but restrained, eyes darting toward her with unspoken questions. Finally, she produced her spare key, a precaution she had learned over years of anticipating village mishaps. The lock clicked reluctantly, and the door creaked open, revealing a tableau that froze her blood. Celia's living room was immaculate, every decoration in place, candles flickering gently, ornaments glinting from the tree. But there was a stillness so profound it felt unnatural, almost rehearsed. Celia lay in the center of the room, hands folded neatly across her chest, her posture rigid in a way that suggested careful placement rather than peaceful sleep. Her eyes, once sharp and commanding, were closed forever, and her polished attire now seemed grotesquely formal against the casual warmth of her surroundings. The festive decorations, the twinkling lights, the wreaths, the meticulously wrapped gifts clashed with the quiet horror of her absence. Agatha felt a shiver ripple through her, the kind that demanded attention and action. This was no accident, and the precision of it whispered of intent rather than chaos. The sound of sirens grew distant as the police arrived, their uniforms crisp against the snow, their demeanor formal yet alert. Officers moved with practiced efficiency, cordoning the house and marking evidence with careful steps. Yet Agatha's mind raced ahead of them, cataloging motives, relationships, and the invisible tensions that had so recently danced across the farewell gathering. She noted the way the room had been arranged, how certain objects had been shifted, the slight smudge on the polished floor suggesting someone had lingered longer than polite custom demanded. It was a scene meant to communicate something, a final message wrapped in calm and control. As officers questioned neighbors and called for statements, Agatha's eyes traced the familiar lines of the room. Celia's desk displayed letters stacked neatly, yet one envelope was missing, perhaps removed with care. A teacup sat half full, its contents cold, as though someone had left in a hurry or paused to stage the scene. Agatha felt the familiar spark of intuition ignite. This was personal, calculated, emotional. The farewell party was no longer a simple village celebration. It had become a reckoning, each smile and comment now cast in a sinister light. Every guest who had attended was suddenly suspect in a web of human emotion, power, and resentment. The village itself seemed to hold its breath. Outside, snow continued to fall silently, erasing footprints, masking the evidence of comings and goings. Agatha stepped back, absorbing the quiet horror, her mind weaving connections between past grievances and present precision. The question pressed against her relentlessly. Who wanted control one last time, and why had it ended in death? Her instincts told her the answer lay not in chance, but in intention, and that unraveling it would require patience, observation, and a willingness to see beyond the holiday veneer.
Chapter 3. Politeness is a Weapon. Agatha Raisin returned to her cottage, the chill of the morning snow still clinging to her coat, and sank into her favorite armchair by the fire. Steam curled from a fresh cup of tea as she closed her eyes for a moment, replaying the farewell party in her mind. Every conversation, every smile, every carefully measured compliment now bore a new weight. She could hear the tones in her memory, soft, sweet, polite, but threaded through each was a subtle sharpness, like glass hidden beneath silk. Celia had a way of speaking that drew people in, only to remind them, almost imperceptibly, of their inferiority. Her first visitor was Mrs. Fennell, the baker's wife, who had been especially effusive during the party. Agatha noted the flicker of hesitation as Mrs. Fennell recounted Celia's kindness. "Oh, she was lovely," she said, voice airy, eyes avoiding Agatha's gaze. "Always knew just what to say, but sometimes, one felt a little small." The pause spoke volumes. Agatha jotted mental notes. Compliments had been delivered like daggers coated in sugar, every word a tool of subtle manipulation. Even those who outwardly adored Celia had been carefully managed, each moment of interaction shaping how they felt about themselves and about her. Next, she spoke with Mr. Hargrove, a retired schoolteacher who had once hosted Celia at a village committee meeting. Celia had charm, he admitted, fingering his teacup nervously. Impossible to resist at first, but afterwards she had a way of making you question everything you thought you knew. She could smile while reminding you of your mistakes. It was unsettling, really. Agatha nodded slowly, absorbing the nuances of his recollection. This was no ordinary personality. It was a carefully wielded influence, one that left emotional scars carefully disguised beneath civility. Even Mrs. Pevensey, the florist, offered insight unintentionally. I suppose Celia was polite," she murmured, arranging a sprig of holly in a vase, "though sometimes I couldn't tell if she was praising you or pointing out your failures. Hard to explain. It's just that her presence lingered." Agatha's eyes narrowed slightly. The repeated pattern was clear. Celia's interactions were never simple, never benign. Each compliment carried a hidden edge, each smile a shadow of control. Villagers may have nodded along politely, but beneath the veneer, resentment simmered and fear took root. Agatha leaned back in her chair, tea cooling in the cup beside her. She recalled subtle gestures from the party, the tilt of Celia's head as she listened, the flicker of her eyes as she weighed words, the tiny adjustments of posture that reinforced dominance. Every detail now revealed itself as deliberate. Even the seemingly minor incidents, the carefully timed jokes, the pointed gift choices, the emphasis on certain words were tools in a quiet, emotional chess game. People left feeling judged, measured, and subtly diminished. It was artistry disguised as charm, cruelty wrapped in politeness. The fire crackled as Agatha pondered the implications. This was not about malice for malice's sake. It was about control, mastery over perception. Those who had attended the farewell had been dancing on the edges of her influence, and the departure of Celia Mountford left a void that no one could ignore. The challenge now was to uncover who had truly suffered the most beneath that polished smile, and whether resentment had hardened into something far more dangerous. Agatha's mind sharpened, cataloging each detail like pieces of a puzzle. Emotional scars were invisible, but she had learned long ago that their consequences could be devastating.
Agatha returned to Celia Mountford's living room later that afternoon, careful not to disturb the crime scene, yet drawn irresistibly to the neatly arranged gifts that had been left behind. Each present was perfectly wrapped, bows tied with precision, glitter dusting the edges in a way that suggested thoughtfulness rather than haste. The air still carried a faint scent of pine and wax from the candles, a fragile reminder of the festive cheer that had been abruptly overshadowed. Agatha approached slowly, letting her gaze rest on each package, reading between the lines of paper and ribbon as she had long learned to read people. She picked up the first gift, a small box wrapped in gold foil. Inside was a delicate ornament, a miniature sleigh, its runners painted with fine brushstrokes. It seemed innocent enough until Agatha noticed a tiny inscription on the base, almost invisible, "For memories that must never fade." Her brow furrowed. Memories? Was this a sentimental gesture or a veiled accusation? She set it aside carefully, filing it away in her mind. Every gift had a story, every ribbon a message, and in this room, even generosity could carry an unspoken meaning. The next package was heavier, wrapped in deep green paper with a crimson bow. Agatha untied it slowly, sensing the weight was more than physical. Inside was a hand-carved jewelry box, intricate in detail, polished to a mirror sheen. But within the box lay a note, folded meticulously. "Some debts cannot be forgotten, only repaid." Agatha's fingers tingled as she read it. The sentiment was neither playful nor affectionate. It carried guilt, yes, but also a subtle reminder of past failures, of obligations left unmet. Someone had chosen this gift carefully, calculated to land with emotional impact, to communicate something that words alone might have failed to convey. Her eyes scanned the room, noting that each remaining gift was arranged deliberately around the tree, almost theatrically, as though to be discovered in a particular order. One present stood out, a simple, neatly wrapped box tied with white satin ribbon. Agatha hesitated before picking it up. The paper was unmarked, pristine, almost innocuous, yet she sensed an undercurrent of intention. Inside was a small figurine, a porcelain bird with one wing slightly bent. To the casual observer, it was charming, delicate, but Agatha felt a pang of recognition. This gift was meant to signal something unresolved, a confession disguised as kindness. She could not yet place the giver, but the choice had been deliberate, personal, and in retrospect, ominous. Walking around the room, Agatha catalogued the visual and symbolic cues. The arrangement of gifts, the inscriptions, the tone of the notes, all pointed to careful premeditation. This was not a crime of impulse, nor a sudden outburst of anger. Someone had chosen each object with emotional precision, layering messages, planting guilt, and testing responses. The farewell had been more than a celebration. It had been a stage for manipulation, for influence, for control. And now, in the quiet aftermath, the evidence lay not only in the absence of life, but in the very objects intended to honor it. Agatha stepped back, considering the broader picture. She realized with a chill that the murder itself had likely been preceded by a series of emotionally charged interactions, each one subtly pushing the boundaries of morality and sentiment. The gifts, far from trivial, had been carefully selected to reveal fault lines, to evoke remorse, and perhaps even to provoke a final reckoning. Someone had thought through every detail, anticipating reactions, and using the guise of generosity to communicate a deeper, darker truth. As she closed the last box gently, Agatha knew the question that would guide her next steps. Which gift had crossed the line from kindness into confession, and who had chosen it with that intent?
Chapter 4. Christmas Doesn't Soften Motives. Snow drifted lazily over Carsely, settling in soft layers along the lanes and blanketing the cottages in an almost storybook perfection. Yet beneath this calm exterior, Agatha Raisin sensed the village's pulse was far from peaceful. The farewell party's aftermath had left traces, subtle cracks in the facade, and she was determined to follow them wherever they led. As she walked past frosted hedges, memories of previous encounters with Celia resurfaced, each one sharpening the contours of understanding she had begun to build. The polished surface of the village could not hide the undercurrents of control and resentment that had festered for years. Agatha began by revisiting conversations she had overheard during the party. A quiet remark from Mrs. Fennell about a garden club dispute, dismissed at the time as trivial, now revealed layers of humiliation carefully orchestrated by Celia. One neighbor's failed attempt at a communal baking competition had been the subject of a pointed joke, wrapped in polite concern, yet intended to remind them of past shortcomings. Agatha's eyes narrowed as she considered the ripple effects of such incidents. Celia's influence had been subtle but pervasive, each word and action calculated to reinforce her dominance while leaving others doubting themselves. The village's interconnected relationships unfolded before her like a map of quiet warfare. Friendships once thought solid had been sabotaged, partnerships strained by her manipulations. Invitations withheld, compliments laced with criticism, favors extended only under strict conditions. Every interaction had been a thread in a complex web. Agatha traced the patterns back over months, noticing recurring themes: control exerted under the guise of generosity, loyalty enforced through obligation, and private humiliation disguised as concern. It was a social chess game, and Celia had long been a master player. Despite her disapproval, Agatha felt a measure of sympathy. She could understand the drive for control, the desire to shape one's surroundings and protect personal vulnerabilities behind a mask of composure. Celia's life had not been devoid of challenges. Her polished exterior had been carefully maintained through effort and vigilance. Yet sympathy did not translate to excuse. Agatha understood the moral weight of deliberate emotional manipulation and the harm left in its wake. Every humiliation, every forced smile and calculated remark had sown seeds of tension that now ripened in dangerous ways. The snow muffled footsteps as Agatha visited the next few houses, speaking casually with villagers under the pretense of small talk, while noting the hesitation in their replies. Patterns emerged. Some hesitated to speak, others volunteered stories tinged with resentment. All bore marks of Celia's influence, subtle but unmistakable once recognized. Even those who had left the party smiling broadly had carried an invisible weight, a sense of being measured and judged, held accountable for perceived slights, and gently reminded of past mistakes. Agatha catalogued each account, weaving together a portrait of quiet tyranny beneath holiday cheer. As she paused near the village square, the snow swirling in lazy spirals, Agatha reflected on the delicate balance that had been disrupted. Old wounds once carefully concealed were exposed in the wake of Celia's absence and eventual death. The subtle bitterness, the unspoken rivalries, the smothered indignities, all pointed toward someone pushed beyond patience, someone whose breaking point had finally arrived. Agatha's mind sharpened, tracing connections, observing nuances, and noting where emotional pressure had been greatest. She understood the stakes and the danger, yet the question lingered as chilling as the winter air. Who had finally snapped, and why now, at the heart of Christmas, when appearance demanded cheer, but reality demanded reckoning?
Agatha Raisin walked slowly through the village streets, the snow crunching beneath her boots, each step echoing softly in the still morning. The village seemed untouched by tension, yet her instincts prickled with the knowledge that appearances were misleading. Conversations she had overheard, glimpses of hesitant gestures, and the careful avoidance of certain topics all pointed towards something unspoken, something collectively protected. Carsely, she realized, was holding a secret, one that no one dared articulate aloud, yet all were complicit in preserving. It was a lie everyone agreed on, and the weight of it pressed against the edges of her awareness. She began with casual inquiries, stopping at familiar cottages under the guise of friendly greetings. "Seen anything unusual?" she asked lightly, observing the subtle reactions. The answers were swift, polite, and rehearsed, but tiny hesitations betrayed unease. A neighbor glanced away, muttered a generality about snow and errands, then rushed inside as though embarrassed to linger. Another smiled too brightly, offering a canned reassurance that everything was fine. Agatha catalogued each evasion, noting which stories were too uniform, which explanations were too neat, and which eyes darted nervously when a particular name was mentioned. Her thoughts returned to the farewell party and the subtle hostilities she had witnessed. Some villagers had been more invested than others in maintaining appearances, and now she saw why. The shared lie seemed designed to shield someone, a carefully constructed wall to preserve comfort, or perhaps to protect guilt. Each act of politeness, each turn of phrase was part of the same intricate dance. Loyalty to the village and its unspoken agreements had temporarily overridden honesty, even in the shadow of murder. Agatha felt a twinge of frustration, recognizing that these small deceptions, though meant to maintain harmony, complicated her understanding of who was responsible. The clues were in the details most people overlooked. A curtain drawn too tightly, a door left slightly ajar, footsteps muffled in the snow, gestures that seemed rehearsed, they all pointed toward a protective pattern. It was as if the village itself had conspired to shield someone from scrutiny, using social cohesion as a form of defense. Agatha's eyes narrowed as she processed the implications. Someone's transgressions, perhaps even their role in Celia's death, were being concealed not by malice, but by collective habit, by a desire to preserve civility and Christmas cheer, even at the expense of truth. She paused at the village green, where children's laughter punctuated the still air. Even here, beneath the innocence of play, Agatha saw the subtle hierarchies and loyalties at work. Adults whispered near hedges, glances were exchanged over frosted railings, and every encounter carried the unspoken reminder that some truths were better left buried. The lie everyone agreed on was a delicate equilibrium, one maintained with vigilance and care. Yet Agatha knew equilibrium was fragile, and each omission, each evasion, brought the village closer to a tipping point. Returning toward Celia's house, Agatha reflected on the dynamics at play. Loyalty, fear, guilt, and habit had combined to create a collective shield, protecting someone from the scrutiny they deserved. The implications were clear. The village had taken sides unconsciously, and in doing so, they had made her task infinitely more complex. The question pressed upon her with chilling clarity. Who was being shielded, and at what cost? Every polite word and careful glance now carried the weight of deception.
and Agatha realized that unraveling this lie would be just as critical as solving the murder itself.
Chapter 5. Agatha pushes too hard. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke, yet it seemed unusually heavy as Agatha Raisin stepped out of her cottage. She had barely begun her walk through the village when a figure emerged from behind the low stone wall near the square. The familiar smile of Mrs. Pevensey was slightly too tight, her eyes darting nervously to the street before meeting Agatha's. "Dear, you really mustn't read too much into things," she said softly, her tone polite but laced with something sharper beneath the surface. "Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie, especially at this time of year." Agatha paused, sensing the layers beneath the words, a veiled warning, carefully phrased, yet impossible to ignore. Her instincts, honed over years of village intrigue, told her this was deliberate, a subtle nudge meant to intimidate without revealing itself outright. She studied Mrs. Pevensey, noting the faint quiver in her hands and the micro-expressions that betrayed unease. Polite speech could be armor, she thought, but it also revealed the fears and loyalties that people could not fully suppress. Someone wanted her to stop probing, and the village had its reasons. "I appreciate the concern," Agatha replied lightly, folding her scarf against the cold. "But sometimes concern and truth are not the same thing." Her eyes swept across the cobbled street, scanning for any hint of surveillance, any sign that others had witnessed the interaction. The square was empty save for a few children dragging sleds and a postman making his rounds. Yet the sense of tension hung as heavily as fog, subtle but unmistakable. Agatha felt a pulse of anticipation. She was close, perhaps closer than anyone realized. Later, at the bakery, she found similar signs. The baker himself handed over a loaf of bread with overly formal courtesy, his words smooth, his eyes a touch too calculating. "You're quite thorough, Agatha," he said, voice calm. "But sometimes curiosity can be unwise. Best to focus on the holiday spirit, isn't it?" Agatha smiled, nodding, all the while noting the tiny shifts of his body, the tap of a foot, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided eye contact when certain names were mentioned. Veiled warnings were everywhere. The village seemed to whisper collectively, urging her to tread carefully. Yet the subtle pressure only sharpened her resolve. She could not ignore the patterns she had observed, the inconsistencies, or the whispers of guilt lurking beneath smiles. Every carefully chosen word, every measured glance, only confirmed that someone in Carsely had the most to gain if she backed off. That person, whoever they were, was desperate to maintain control, preserve secrets, and prevent the truth from emerging. Agatha felt a thrill of determination. She would not be guided by fear, no matter how polite or cunningly framed the threats. By mid-afternoon, she returned to the square, surveying the village in its snow-dusted serenity. Children's laughter echoed, bells jingled softly from shop doors. Yet every glance, every passing smile now carried hidden meaning. The veiled warnings had been delivered. She had heard them clearly. Still, Agatha felt certain that pressing further would yield results. There was something crucial, a tipping point waiting to be reached, and she intended to reach it, even if the village itself seemed aligned against her. Every subtle gesture, every cautious whisper now felt like a challenge issued directly to her, and she accepted it. The game was accelerating, and she was ready. Agatha Raisin sat in her cottage that evening, snow drifting lazily against the windowpane, and allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The village had returned to its deceptive calm, lights twinkling in shop windows, and the faint hum of carolers in the distance. But beneath the festive exterior, a truth pressed insistently against her mind. Celia Mountford's death was not an accident. Nor was it born from random anger. The careful arrangement of gifts, the meticulously staged farewell, the subtle tensions she had catalogued, all pointed to a single chilling conclusion. Someone had exercised control, wrapping cruelty in the guise of mercy. The thought made her shiver. Agatha reconstructed the sequence in her mind, the gifts selected to evoke guilt and reflection, each comment from the farewell party carefully measured, every smile and compliment a silent test, and then the ultimate act. Celia's life taken with precision, staged so neatly that it almost resembled rest. The very idea of murder as a kindness was grotesque, yet here it was, framed as a final, merciful gesture. Whoever had done this had understood human emotion profoundly, manipulating it to convey a perverse form of compassion while maintaining the illusion of control. Agatha recalled the notes tucked inside the gifts, the delicate inscriptions, the seemingly innocent phrases that carried emotional weight. They were not random, not impulsive, not mere expressions of resentment. They were part of a carefully orchestrated plan, a psychological blueprint executed with attention to detail. Each gesture reinforced a narrative that this was an ending, a tidy closure for Celia and for the village's tangled emotional debts. Yet beneath the veneer of mercy lay intent, strategy, and dominance. The act of killing had been framed as love, a final lesson in obedience and acknowledgement of power. Her thoughts turned to the villagers who had attended the farewell. Politeness, restraint, and subtle warnings had concealed far more than they revealed. Agatha realized that the murder's emotional framing was mirrored in the social choreography. Everyone had unwittingly played a role, whether by offering gifts, exchanging compliments, or holding back truths. The killer had relied on the village's own conventions, its collective complicity, to shield their actions. Control had been absolute, expressed not just through violence, but through manipulation of hearts and minds, a psychological dominance that extended beyond Celia's life into every interaction that had led up to it. Agatha's pulse quickened as she connected the threads. This was not mere revenge, nor a spontaneous act of rage. It was calculated, deliberate, and suffused with the belief that the act itself was justified. The concept of mercy had been twisted into a tool, a mask to obscure the cold reality beneath. Celia's charm and dominance had provoked fear, resentment, and guilt, and the murderer had exploited those emotions to craft a finale that appeared gentle while asserting absolute authority. The psychological artistry was unnerving. Leaning back, Agatha traced the implications. This revelation reframed everything she had observed: the veiled warnings, the collective lies, the symbolic gifts, and the subtle rivalries. What had seemed like ordinary village dynamics were now the prelude to something darker. Murder had been disguised as kindness, control disguised as concern, and the question remained simmering beneath the frost and tinsel: can any act of death ever truly be gentle, or is such a notion a dangerous illusion crafted by those who seek to manipulate both life and conscience? Agatha knew she was close to the answers, yet the human heart, she reminded herself, was always capable of surprises.
Chapter 6. Truth in Candlelight. The village was quiet that evening, snow settling in soft, uneven layers across the rooftops, the kind of hush that made even distant footsteps feel amplified. Agatha Raisin lingered near Celia Mountford's home, her mind replaying every interaction she had observed since the farewell party. One fact had begun to crystallize with unnerving clarity. Someone had stayed longer than was appropriate, someone whose presence had been motivated not by malice alone, but by attachment, dependence, a tangled emotional tether to Celia. The patterns she had catalogued, once abstract, now coalesced into a sharper image. Agatha remembered the careful way certain villagers had lingered at the party, offering gifts, exchanging small talk, always hovering near Celia as though seeking approval, reassurance, or perhaps forgiveness.
In the aftermath, subtle hints of anxiety, regret, and lingering guilt had appeared in their behavior, too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. And now, with the passage of snow-draped hours, those moments began to speak in clearer tones. The killer had been someone enmeshed with Celia, whose emotions had grown dependent on her control, whose desire to resolve or release that connection had driven them past the boundary between life and death. She retraced the steps, mentally reconstructing the night of the farewell. Who had lingered near the tree longer than polite custom allowed? Who had offered gifts with a tremor in their hand, an edge of hesitation, or a glance that lingered beyond what was comfortable? One figure emerged repeatedly in her memory, a quiet, unassuming presence, polite to the point of subservience, yet whose eyes had betrayed both longing and fear. That lingering, that unwillingness to leave, had created the perfect window for action. Agatha's intuition sharpened, guiding her to the inevitable conclusion. This was someone who believed they were finishing an unfinished chapter, closing a loop that only they fully understood. The room's dim candlelight flickering softly across the snow-white surfaces cast elongated shadows that danced like echoes of past interactions. Agatha's mind traced the psychological terrain, the subtle manipulations, the carefully timed compliments, the quiet humiliations that had woven Celia's web. For the killer, these moments had not been harmless. They had created emotional dependency, an almost magnetic pull that made it impossible to disengage. In the killer's eyes, ending Celia's control had perhaps felt merciful, a necessary liberation for both the puppet and the puppeteer. The moral ambiguity pressed against Agatha's reasoning, a reminder that human hearts are never simple, even in murder. Even as she pieced the puzzle together, Agatha noted the lingering traces in the environment. A door left slightly ajar, a misplaced gift, a footprint half hidden by the evening snow, tiny signatures of hesitation, presence, and intent. They were subtle, but Agatha had long learned to read between the lines of ordinary gestures. Every small anomaly aligned with a single narrative. The one who had stayed too long had acted at the intersection of fear, guilt, and devotion. They had been compelled by something stronger than anger, something almost tragically human. As the candlelight flickered across the mantel, Agatha felt the weight of understanding settle over her. The act was not random, nor entirely cold-blooded. It had been motivated by a desire to end control, to close a chapter, to resolve an unbearable tension. And yet, in the clarity of her deduction, a question lingered like smoke in the room. Had the killer truly intended to kill, or had they believed, in their own way, that they were delivering mercy? Agatha's mind raced, cataloging motives, weighing consequences, and preparing to confront a truth that was as psychologically complex as it was morally unsettling. The village of Carsely was draped in quiet as Christmas Eve approached, the fading light casting long shadows across snow-covered roofs. Agatha Raisin stood at the edge of the Mountford cottage, her breath rising in faint clouds, heart steady but expectant. Inside, the room was warm, lit only by the soft glow of a single candle on the mantel and the twinkling lights of a modest Christmas tree. There was no fanfare, no audience, only the intimate stillness that comes when the world pauses to listen. Agatha had come to speak, but she also knew that tonight she might witness truths too long buried. The figure in the room shifted slightly, shoulders hunched, hands twisting nervously. Agatha noted the subtle tremor, the way the eyes darted toward every shadow, every flicker of candlelight. "You wanted to see me," Agatha said, her voice calm, measured, carrying neither accusation nor judgment, only the quiet insistence that silence could no longer protect. The room seemed to shrink, filled with tension so delicate it could have been shattered by a single misplaced word. The snow outside muted the village entirely, leaving nothing but their shared breath and the faint scent of pine and wax. The person in question, once a familiar face at the farewell, met Agatha's gaze with hesitation. I "I suppose you want the truth," they said softly, voice nearly swallowed by the room's warmth. The words felt heavy, laden with the weight of months of unspoken conflict. Agatha nodded slightly, her hands resting calmly at her sides. "Yes," she replied, "the truth, nothing more, nothing less. No judgment, only understanding." And in that, a subtle invitation was extended. Speak freely, unburden yourself, let the silence dissolve. The confession came slowly, carefully, each word deliberate, as though being spoken aloud made it real. "It wasn't meant to happen this way," the voice admitted, trembling now. "I didn't intend for her life to end. I thought I was freeing her, ending what I believed she had control over. I wanted closure, not blood." Agatha's eyes never wavered. She listened intently, allowing the words to land fully. The confession was not dramatic, not performative. It was a gentle, devastating release, the culmination of guilt and emotional strain made manifest. Every detail mattered, the way the speaker's shoulders slumped with relief and remorse, the slight quiver of fingers that had been clenched too tightly for too long, the unsteady cadence of a heart finally unburdening itself. Agatha noted each nuance, each micro-expression, cataloging truth not only in words, but in presence, in the quiet honesty that could not be fabricated. The snow outside reflected the dim glow of the candlelight, as though the village itself bore witness to the revelation, silent but attentive. Minutes passed in soft rhythm, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fireplace. Agatha's gaze softened, offering reassurance that truth spoken gently could be heard without judgment, that confession need not be met with anger. And as the final words fell into the quiet room, a weight lifted, intangible yet profound. The act, though irreversible, had now been contextualized, framed not as cold-blooded malice, but as a tragic, flawed attempt at mercy, colored by fear, dependence, and a misguided desire to assert control. Agatha finally spoke, voice low, calm, carrying the warmth of understanding rather than reprimand. "It's done," she said simply. "The truth is out. Now we can begin to understand, to make sense of it all." And for the first time since Celia's death, the room seemed to breathe, a gentle exhale of relief and sorrow intertwined, soothing and devastating all at once. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the village in silence, and within, a confession spoken quietly had begun the long work of reconciliation and understanding.
Chapter 7. The Farewell Explained. The candlelight flickered across the room as Agatha Raisin sat quietly, listening to the figure before her. There was no panic, no accusation, only the calm gravity that comes when truth, long hidden, is finally laid bare. The killer's voice was soft, measured, each word weighed as though speaking too quickly might shatter everything. "I never wanted this," they began, eyes downcast, hands folded in uneasy restraint. "I thought I was helping, ending something that had gone too far, controlling everyone, controlling me. I believed it was mercy, not malice." Agatha nodded slightly, observing without judgment. Her expression remained composed, betraying nothing, but inwardly she catalogued every inflection, every hesitation, every flicker of emotion. The confession was not defensive, it was explanatory. The murderer had lived under Celia's influence, shaped by her subtle manipulations, and had acted with the conviction that taking control of the final outcome was, in some way, necessary. It was a crime born of care, twisted by devotion and fear into something irreversible. "I watched her every day," the voice continued, soft but steady. "Her presence, it lingered, not just for me but for everyone around her. Each compliment, each kind word had a weight I couldn't ignore. I believed she had to be stopped, but I didn't want anyone else to suffer, especially not her. I thought, if I ended it gently, no one would be hurt further." Agatha's eyes traced the subtle lines of regret etched into the speaker's face. Every gesture, every carefully chosen word revealed the depth of their emotional struggle.
The act had not been impulsive or selfish. It had been calculated through the lens of compassion, warped by obsession and necessity. The room remained quiet except for the faint crackle of the fireplace and the soft tick of the mantel clock. Agatha could sense the tension in the figure's shoulders, the tremor in their hands, the way their gaze flickered nervously to the small Christmas tree in the corner. Each detail underscored the tragedy of the act, a deliberate choice intended to protect, framed as mercy, executed with precision. Yet precision could not erase consequence. Celia's life was gone, and the village's fragile calm had been shattered, no matter how carefully the crime had been staged. "I thought it would end with peace," the figure admitted, voice barely audible. "Not screams, not anger, just closure. I never meant to frighten anyone, to cause pain. I only wanted control, in the only way I knew I could have it." Agatha's gaze softened slightly, though she remained unmoved. Understanding did not equal approval. Empathy did not erase responsibility. She saw the tragedy for what it was, a person trapped by emotion, by devotion, by fear, making choices that had catastrophic consequences despite the kindness they imagined they were delivering. She leaned back slightly, letting the silence stretch. "You acted with intention," Agatha said, calmly, voice steady and unhurried. "You believed it was mercy. That doesn't excuse the outcome, but it explains it. And now we have to reconcile both, the truth of your intent and the reality of what happened." The words carried no judgment, only clarity, leaving space for reflection. Outside, snow continued to fall softly, muffling the village in a quiet cocoon. Inside, Agatha and the killer sat with the truth laid bare between them, an uncomfortable but necessary equilibrium. Justice and mercy collided, intertwined, leaving no simple resolution. The room seemed suspended in the tension of understanding, a delicate balance of responsibility, intention, and human error. And Agatha knew that while the past could not be changed, the present could finally hold honesty, and perhaps, in time, peace. The morning light filtered through frosted windows, soft and pale, touching the village of Carsely with quiet calm. Agatha Raisin walked along the snow-dusted lane toward the Mountford cottage, noting the absence of yesterday's tension, replaced by an uneasy stillness. The police had come, conducted their questions, and collected statements with methodical precision. There was no fanfare, no dramatic arrests. The process had been clinical, respectful, and gentle, reflecting the small, interconnected nature of the village. Closure had arrived softly, like snow settling over the landscape, blanketing harshness rather than drawing attention to it. Inside the cottage, the detective explained their findings in measured tones, nodding occasionally to Agatha as though acknowledging her insight without needing to verbalize it. It was premeditated, the officer said, but motivated more by emotional entanglement than malice. Circumstances allowed for careful planning, not opportunistic violence. "We'll proceed according to the law, but the facts are clear." Agatha listened, her mind cataloging every word, every implication. The killer's motives, the village's complicity, the subtle choreography of fear and devotion, all had been laid bare. Now the machinery of justice would operate quietly, unobtrusively, respecting the delicate equilibrium of the village's emotions. The killer, still present in the room under polite supervision, did not resist. There was no defiance, no theatrics, only a quiet acceptance that their actions had consequences. Agatha observed the gentle arc of their shoulders, the downward tilt of their head, the slow, deliberate breathing that suggested resignation and comprehension. Justice was coming, not with fury, but as a measured acknowledgement of responsibility. In that moment, Agatha realized that closure did not demand triumph or vindication, only understanding, both for the perpetrator and for those left behind. Outside, villagers went about their routines, brushing snow from their doorsteps, carrying bundles of firewood, exchanging brief greetings. The sense of communal life persisted, now tinged with reflection rather than gossip or tension. Agatha noticed how subtle gestures, the way neighbors glanced at one another, the quiet nods of acknowledgement, signaled collective processing. The events of the past days would not vanish, but the village had begun the gentle work of absorbing them, of integrating grief, guilt, and relief into the fabric of daily life. Agatha herself felt the shift. She walked past the familiar storefronts and cottages, aware that the snow-covered roofs and softly jingling bells could not erase tragedy, yet they provided a rhythm, a grounding sense of continuity. The consequences had arrived, quietly but irrevocably, leaving room for reflection and understanding rather than spectacle. Even the children playing with sleds in the square seemed to sense the subdued tone of the village, their laughter gentle, not brash, blending seamlessly with the quiet resilience of the town. Returning to her cottage, Agatha poured herself a cup of tea, letting the warmth seep into her hands. There was no triumph in the day's events, no victory to savor, only the soft reassurance that truth had been acknowledged and responsibility accepted. The village could heal, slowly, as hearts adjusted to the knowledge of human frailty, as routines reasserted themselves, and as communal bonds absorbed the strain of recent revelations. Agatha sipped her tea, contemplative but satisfied that justice and compassion had found a quiet balance. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the village in pristine white. The quiet resolution was not dramatic, nor was it perfect, but it was enough. Carsely had survived the ordeal with dignity intact, and while wounds remained, the first threads of healing were weaving themselves into the daily rhythms of the village. Agatha Raisin, ever vigilant yet quietly hopeful, understood that life, even after tragedy, could continue, softly, deliberately, and with gentle grace. Chapter 8. Kitchens warm again. The morning sun spilled softly over Carsely, glinting on frost-tipped rooftops and sparkling in the icy drifts that lined the lanes. Agatha Raisin walked slowly through the village, taking in the familiar sights of chimneys sending wisps of smoke into pale winter air and shop windows dusted lightly with snow. The bustle of the season had returned, muted yet comforting, villagers delivering parcels, children laughing quietly, the scent of baking drifting from half-open doors. Carsely was waking gently from the tension of recent days, returning to the routines that defined it. Agatha paused at the crossroads, watching a neighbor brush snow from their doorstep. She felt the subtle rhythm of life returning, steps measured, greetings exchanged with warmth, tasks performed with purpose. There was no fanfare, no dramatic gestures of triumph, only the small, deliberate acts that knit a community back together. Even after tragedy, even after betrayal and loss, the village seemed determined to maintain the fabric of everyday life. Agatha recognized that resilience was rarely loud. It was quiet, intimate, and understated, like the snow settling over rooftops and hedges. Returning to her cottage, Agatha entered her kitchen, where the familiar warmth of the hearth greeted her. The kettle steamed gently, the aroma of brewing tea mingled with the faint scent of cinnamon from the biscuits she had prepared the day before. Hodge twined around her legs, purring contentedly, oblivious to the human complexities that had dominated the week. Agatha smiled softly, bending to scratch behind his ears, feeling the comforting pull of routine and domesticity. Here, in the familiar space of her home, she could pause, reflect, and consider the threads of truth that had recently unraveled across the village. Her mind wandered through the events of the past days, the farewell party, the veiled warnings, the carefully selected gifts, and the ultimate confession. Each step had left traces, emotional footprints that would linger in Carsely long after the snow melted. Yet Agatha understood that the act of facing the truth, however unsettling, had released a measure of tension. The village could now repair itself, not by forgetting, but by acknowledging the complexity of human motives, the frailty of morality, and the power of empathy. Life, even after upheaval, had a way of resuming its gentle rhythms. As she arranged cups on the table, Agatha reflected on the villagers she had come to know more deeply during this ordeal. Faces that once seemed polite masks now carried the faint traces of fear, loyalty, and affection. Relationships had been tested, but the subtle bonds of community endured.
There was a quiet grace in the way people adapted, in the way small courtesies, shared chores, and daily gestures stitched life back together. Agatha felt a gentle satisfaction in observing this slow, deliberate repair, a reminder that even when darkness intruded, light could persist in the everyday. She moved to the window, gazing out at the square, where snow continued to fall in delicate flakes. Children slid down gentle hillsides, neighbors exchanged smiles over fences, and shopkeepers opened doors to familiar customers. The village's heartbeat had resumed its steady pace, steady yet tempered by awareness. Agatha understood that the events of the past week would leave their mark, subtle but enduring, shaping future interactions and memories. What lingered after truth was not chaos, but reflection, resilience, and the quiet capacity to continue even after tragedy. Agatha poured herself a cup of tea, feeling the warmth spread through her hands and chest. She settled into her chair, Hodge curled at her feet, and let the moment settle around her. Carsely was alive, restored in its gentle, deliberate way. The snow continued to drift outside, covering the village in pristine white, a silent witness to endurance, closure, and the beginnings of renewal. Here, in the quiet of her kitchen, Agatha allowed herself a rare moment of contentment, savoring the simple, comforting certainty that life could resume and the village could heal, one small act at a time.
The morning light broke softly over Carsely, illuminating frost on rooftops and icicles glittering like tiny chandeliers. Agatha Raisin stepped onto her porch, breath curling in the cold air, and looked out at the village she had come to know so intimately over the past weeks. It was Christmas morning, yet unlike other years, there were no grand gestures, no forced cheer or elaborate displays. The village was quieter, simpler, more honest. Decorations twinkled modestly, and neighbors exchanged greetings that were warm, unpretentious, and real. For once, life felt uncluttered by pretense. Agatha walked slowly down the lane, noting the subtle shifts in her fellow villagers. Conversations were candid but gentle, smiles genuine without the weight of hidden agendas. Children played freely in the snow, their laughter ringing out without the usual undertones of rivalry or competition. Even the shops opened late, offering small treats and festive warmth rather than elaborate spectacles. The tension that had shadowed Carsely since Celia Mountford's departure and subsequent death had faded, replaced by a calm acceptance of imperfection, of lives lived fully with all their contradictions. She paused at the Mountford cottage, where the first hints of recovery were evident. The house, once tense with the echoes of farewell and tragedy, now seemed just another home in the village, quiet but still familiar. Agatha observed the subtle signs: curtains drawn but neat, a wreath on the door slightly askew, a light flickering warmly from within. Life, she realized, didn't need perfection to be meaningful. Closure, honesty, and simple acknowledgement of truth could create a peace far more profound than any carefully orchestrated celebration ever could. Returning to her own kitchen, Agatha set about a modest breakfast, letting the simplicity of the task ground her. The kettle steamed, cinnamon drifted from freshly baked biscuits, and Hodge circled her legs in eager anticipation. The comfort of routine had returned, uncomplicated by hidden agendas or veiled warnings. She poured herself a cup of tea, the warmth seeping slowly into her hands, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle in her chest. The village had survived. People had confronted the truth, and for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of equilibrium. Agatha reflected on the lessons of the past weeks. Control could be cruel, intentions could be misread, and human hearts were rarely simple. Yet she recognized resilience, empathy, and the power of gentle understanding. Carsely, imperfect and flawed, had found a path through grief and tension toward clarity and honesty. There was no dramatic resolution, no grand reconciliation, just the slow, deliberate rhythm of life resuming itself with integrity intact. She smiled faintly, acknowledging that peace need not be perfect, only real. Outside, the snow continued to drift in slow, lazy flakes, blanketing the village in quiet beauty. Children's sleds cut fresh tracks across the white, neighbors waved with warmth, and the faint chime of bells marked the passage of the morning. Agatha stepped to the window, letting her gaze sweep across the scene. The village was alive, present, and grounded in truth. Not every ending required forgiveness. Some required only honesty, acknowledgement, and acceptance of human imperfection. The snow, like truth, covered the landscape gently, offering clarity without erasure, calm without pretense. Settling into her chair with Hodge curled beside her, Agatha sipped her tea and breathed deeply. The warmth of the kitchen, the gentle glow of the Christmas tree, and the soft murmur of the village outside combined into a perfect simplicity. She allowed herself to feel satisfaction without relief, peace without triumph, contentment without ceremony. This Christmas, imperfection had been embraced, truth had been honored, and for Agatha Raisin and Carsely alike, that was more than enough.